Welcome to our webinar series where we make Hump Day Hemp Day. I'm Robert Colangelo, host of Green Sense Radio and founder of Hemplet Farms. I'll be your moderator for the webinar series. We're here to raise the bar of integrity in the hemp community with like-minded professionals by sharing information. This is a volunteer effort and a labor of love led by Hemplet Farms, Purdue University Extension Service, the Newton County Soil and Water Conservation District, Biobin, Northwest Indiana Forum, and the Midwest Hemp Council. The Midwest Hemp Council is the premier association representing the hemp industry. Jamie Campbell is the executive director. She's in the know and a person you should know if you're in the hemp business. For those who are not members, I recommend that you join the association. I'm really happy today to introduce our speaker for today's session, Marguerite Bolt. I've had the pleasure of working with her. She's a ball of energy and a real pleasure to work with. And she's going to share her tales from the hemp fields. Marguerite's the first statewide hemp extension specialist for the state of Indiana. She received her bachelor's degree in etymology from Michigan State University and her master's degree in etymology from Purdue University. She is a shameless bug nerd, and she loves to share facts about insects, regardless if you want to hear them or not. She's a Northern Michigan native who loves to be outside, whether it means scuba diving in the ocean, hiking in the woods, or working in the hemp fields. She's just happy to be outdoors. Marguerite will give an overview of what Indiana hemp growers experienced during the 2019 growing season and what we may expect for the 2020 season. With that, I hand it over to Marguerite.
Thanks, Robert. Hopefully everyone's doing well, staying healthy, staying entertained. I am going to start sharing I am going to go over tales from the hemp field. I'm really excited to talk about kind of what our growers experienced. There are a lot of challenges in 2019. There were some success, but from all these challenges, we're able to help more this year. I can't figure out solutions unless I know what the problems are. So I've been fortunate enough to work with lots of growers, lots of extension educators to really understand what 2019 looked like. So one of the things I want growers to kind of think about in the beginning about hemp, because I know we have some prospective hemp growers, but also people who grew in 2019, maybe had some struggles. I want them to think about how it integrates into their system. So maybe we don't have as many challenges this year as we did last year. So I read an article in American Vegetable Grower. If you are a specialty crop producer, just put it in the chat. You may subscribe to this magazine or read their articles, but they had an article asking or having growers, ask themselves if they're ready for a new crop. And it was talking specifically about vegetables, but hemp, especially hemp for cannabinoids or CBD, falls really nicely into that same sort of framework. So asking, what are the consumers focused on? What's trendy? Is it going to fit into your system without making large changes to your current operation? What does the market look like? If you were on last week, you saw Maria Marshall talk. That's recorded if you weren't able to get on. And she talks about the hemp market. And can you get organic designation, which you can in hemp production. So, taking what you know from other crops and applying it to hemp is really helpful. And then overall looking at that trial before you commit to large scale production. One of the biggest challenges we saw last year is growers stretch themselves too thin on resources because they had the land. Just because you have 50 acres doesn't mean you should plant 50 acres of hemp for CBD. So really trialing at a reasonable scale for your operation is the best way to kind of avoid some of those challenges that growers faced. So I want to talk a little bit about the breakdown of production. I know a lot of you are interested in all types of hemp production. You're not exactly sure what type of hemp you may want to focus on. So last year we had almost 700 acres grown for fiber. The majority though was grown for CBD or cannabidiol. So a little over 3,000 acres. And then we have almost 400 acres of grain. So the majority is CBD, that's why I highlighted it. For 2020 production, we had this wonderful survey that all of our growers filled out last year, and we had them estimate what they think they would plant. So this doesn't include new growers for 2020, but they estimated cumulatively about 13,000 acres. Right now, as it sits, there are 8,900 acres registered for 2020, so we're under that mark. And then when we look at how acreage is going to break up into this year, with growers saying, you know, a little over 2,200 acres for fiber, 9,500 acres for CBD, so again, the most popular choice, and almost 700 acres for grain. And then lastly, seed producers, so producing for seed stock. So what does this really mean going forward? We're going to see more CBD across the state. I'm going to focus on that for this talk, but if people are really interested in hearing about grain or fiber, I'd be happy to share resources at the end so you can learn about those systems, because they're quite different than the CBD system. So one of the challenges we had last year is really late planting for a lot of growers. Most of hemp producers planted in June and July, with plantings all the way into mid-July for CBD production. So people setting plants, you know, over the holiday weekend, over 4th of July, all the way into the middle of the month. One grower said he planted in August, which seems at that point kind of like a wash. And then most of our growers are harvesting in September and October. This is kind of what we expected for our growers to harvest kind of in those 2 months, but we did have growers harvest all the way into November after several hard freezes. So that was definitely difficult for growers to actually get out, harvest the plants in a timely manner, you know, being considerate of the THC threshold, trying to secure labor. So that was something that growers struggled with. This year, I think they'll be a little bit more prepared though. So one of the biggest issues that I'm sure all of you are aware of, if you were outside or if you're, you know, planting any other crops in 2019, is that we had a really, really wet spring and early summer. So our growers definitely saw planting issues due to weather. Most of them are falling on kind of the left side of that figure, saying yes, there was an issue due to weather. Mostly the problem was the fields were too saturated. They couldn't get in there with equipment. In some cases, they were completely flooded, like lakefront property. So that was a challenge. Hopefully this year we will have better weather, and only hope for that. One of the other kind of big problems that I saw that I think is going to be resolved, again, we can learn a lot from 2019 from those challenges, were some of the quality issues. So if you are, and I can't read the chat right now, but Robert can, he can check it out. But if you're interested in producing hemp from seed, including CBD production, you can put it in the chat. But this is something that our growers faced. They were receiving seed that was pretty poor quality, had low germination. Some cases it was stated that it was 98% feminized. It definitely was not. So labels not matching up with what's in the bag. In some cases, there weren't even seed labels that we would consider adequate for any other crop. So magic marker written on the bag, little printed labels, not true seed labels on the bag. However, the state chemist is working really hard to kind of resolve this issue and make sure that all the seed coming into the state has a proper label. So we know it's a problem, we're addressing it as best as we can, so hopefully that will resolve itself. One of the other issues, and I've talked to Robert about this, is clone quality. So you say, I'm not going to deal with seeds, I'll go the clone route, I have more consistency, you know, I think that I'm going to get a good plant or tray of plants. But the reality of 2019 was pretty awful for some growers. They were receiving clones from out of state. We didn't have clone production in Indiana at the time of planting for the most part. So growers were purchasing from states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Colorado. And this is an example of what some of our growers were seeing. On the stem of this plant, there are cannabis aphids, and you can see that these are pretty sad looking clones. They don't look happy. Leaves are starting to turn yellow. They're infested with aphids. This particular tray came from Colorado. So lots of out-of-state material coming in. Aphids weren't the only problem. We had poor root development, root rots, hemp russet mite, spider mites, just really poor quality plants. But one of the things that I think is going to change this year is that we have more clone producers in the state of Indiana, which I hope translates to better quality, because oftentimes These are established indoor facilities. They have a reputation. They've been here for decades in some cases. They want to stick around and serve their community. So I think we're going to see better material going into the field because we have better material coming out of these indoor production facilities. This is another kind of issue. This is a figure from University of Wisconsin. That link in the top will take you to their testing tool. It's a really cool feature of their website where you can submit your own testing results. They also work with third-party labs to submit results. But what this really shows is the relationship between CBD and THC and hemp plants. So each spot on this graph is a sample from individual growers. So this particular set has 373 different samples from across the state of Wisconsin. And it shows you there's a really tight relationship between these two cannabinoids. And most of the hemp that growers are putting in the field as of 2019 was not compliant if it was over 12% CBD. So what producers are doing, producers of genetic material, they're taking hemp type cannabis and marijuana type cannabis and breeding them. And that's why you see a bunch of those data points form that line, that linear line right there. So that's something that we're all more aware of now because Wisconsin is not the only state that looked at this relationship. So hopefully going into 2020, growers have a better understanding of what they're purchasing. If it's being marketed as 20% CBD, you're not going to be able to harvest at 20% CBD and also be compliant on THC. I wanted to talk about the top varieties per acre for people who are interested in production for this year, and they want to look at what was actually grown. So overall, cherry wine and cherry uno are the most common, but the caveat with the cherries is that we don't really know how unique they are to each other because cherry is kind of, it's kind of just a name that people are throwing on hemp seed at this point. So unfortunately, you can see on here, there are, I don't know, at least 10 different cherry varieties, and they're really not unique varieties. So it's hard to say how different these all are, but those are the two that, based on what growers are reporting, they grew the most across the state. And then grape soda and blue mammoth were two other varieties commonly grown. This little snapshot is from this link. So if you go to this link on the Purdue Hemp website, you can look at THC by variety specifically for Indiana in 2019. These are examples of some of the different hemp fields in Indiana. So if you didn't have a chance to go out and see different production models in 2019, I snapped some photos so you can get an idea of what it looks like across the state. So we have this kind of bare ground model in the top left. This is sort of the bare bones of production that we saw. One of the benefits of this production model is you don't have as many input costs. You're not laying irrigation or investing in irrigation equipment. You're not paying to put plastic down. This was all hand transplanted. However, the downfall is that it can be really labor intense. Weed management can be challenging without plastic. This was a field that was operated by two people that didn't have a lot of plant production experience, but it actually turned out pretty well and they had some healthy plants in there. We have a white plastic model. So this is raised beds, there's drip tape underneath, they have white plastic. The later you plant in the season, the better it may be to lay white plastic because it gets really, really hot. And there's a cool tool, for pest management because you can shake the branches of the plant and see if any insects fall out or if any insect grass falls out. It's kind of a little pest management or pest monitoring tool. Then we have a similar model with black plastic. This is pretty common across the state of Indiana. So similar raised beds, drip tape underneath, and then black plastic. And really the plastic for growers is going to help with weed management because we don't have herbicides. It's really labor intense to get a bunch of workers out there hoeing the field if you don't have any kind of mechanical weeding devices. And then we have this kind of hybrid of the bare bones and the plastic. So this is raised beds and there is drip tape in the system, but there's no plastic. So this grower has worked with plastic before. They don't like to deal with the cleanup. They don't want plastic particles in their soil. So they are a no plastic system. and they managed weeds earlier in the season around the plants, and then they just mow in between the rows, and it was a beautiful crop. So there are different production models. They can all work. Just figure out what works best in your system. When we look at biomass yield, I'm going to say for some people this was a big success. We have people producing over 1,500 pounds per acre. We're pretty excited about that. But the majority of our growers are in that lower end of production. So they're producing less than 500 or 500 to 1,000 pounds per acre. So take this as you will, because it doesn't say how many plants are set per acre. We don't have that question included in the survey, unfortunately. So, if a grower put out 2,000 plants per acre and their neighbor put out 1,000 plants per acre, their biomass yield is going to be different, even if they had the same size, or if they had the same size plants, because they're just more plants per acre. So that is kind of the caveat of this survey question. But what is probably a little bit more interesting, because this is just an average across the field, regardless of how many plants are set, is the amount of CBD that growers are seeing. So most of our growers are in the 6 to 9% or over 10%. But don't get too excited about the over 10%. Because it doesn't mean that they were compliant. There are a fair amount of growers that weren't compliant. So even if they had over 10%, it doesn't mean that that crop actually went to a processor and to a craft market or anything like that. And from the processor I've talked to, they're seeing more in that 6 to 9% range or lower. So 10% is great. That was the gold standard back in April, but I think it's a little unrealistic at this point, after we've seen 2019, kind of knowing what we know. And then I wanted to throw this in there. I think Maria had this in her slides last time, but I want to attribute this to a success that, yeah, we did have growers that made a profit last year. It wasn't a total wash. 25% of our growers said they made money. So that was really exciting. I guess some processors are probably included in that as well. But people are making money off this, even though it's only 25%. We have growers also breaking even, which is good. They're not losing money. 25% at least broke even. And then the majority, the remaining 50% lost money. However, lots of people are going to grow hemp again this year. People that may have lost money last year, that's kind of the name of the game in farming, regardless of what crop you're putting in the field. Some years you're going to have loss. So growers are, they're not backing down from producing hemp. They're just going to learn from 2019. So this would be a good time for people to ask questions. And then I'm going to talk about some other specific considerations that we learned from 2019 and can expect to be important for 2020.
So Marguerite, thank you. One of the first questions was there was interest in getting information on green and fiber. So how could they get that from you?
So feel free to send me an email. And I have my contact information at the very end of this presentation. And I can send you some slides that I've put together specific to grain and fiber production, as well as some general production information.
So another one that's very timely is with the decline in hemp prices, can people really make money in this market growing hemp for CBD oil?
Yeah, that's kind of tough. And I can't speak for everybody because I think people are making money off CBD oil. It's just kind of hard to tell how things are going to go through the rest of the year. So hopefully there isn't as much product in storage as we hear about. I hear about a lot of raw material in storage, either not being processed or it's in a crude oil state because we just don't have the consumer market. I don't know how true that is, but I've read some economic reports that look pretty grim. But I don't think we'll know until we have, the end of this year's crop harvested.
I think the state of Indiana wanted to issue 300 licenses. Do you know how many licenses have been issued to date?
Yes, unless they approved anything in the last day, 233 licenses have been approved. 206 of those are growers. The other licenses are processors or handlers. So there are some licenses still available.
So that's good news, because last year there was a total of 140 licenses issued. So the market in Indiana is still growing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the main cause for people in your slides, why they lost money?
One, I didn't include it in here. I do have a slide that looks at that. One of the reasons was they just haven't sold their crop, so they haven't accounted for any kind of income from harvested material at this point. And the reason they haven't sold that crop is contracts weren't honored. They are trying to wait for a better price because the price has just decreased so much since last April. Those are the two big reasons. Or they thought they had a processor, they didn't have any kind of agreement, and then that processor fell through. So those are some big reasons why they potentially have lost money, because they are still holding onto material, or they had to destroy their crop, or they had significant weed issues and couldn't weed isn't actual weeds. They couldn't harvest their plants because there was just so much weed pressure in the field. It wasn't worth hiring the labor to pay for that.
The USDA came out with rulings earlier this year, and they did not finalize these, but a number of states now test THC differently. Some are total THC, some are Delta 9. With the Midwest having different regulations in different states, how does that impact the transportation of hemp?
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting time because Illinois just passed a ruling that they are a Delta 9 state, and that's a border state. So if a grower in Illinois wanted to sell material to an Indiana processor, that could be really challenging because they may be compliant in Illinois, but they're definitely not compliant in Indiana. So transportation through states, I think, is going to be, at least in the Midwest, we've tried to kind of figure out guidelines for people transporting hemp. But when it goes to the actual destination to get processed, you know, they need to make sure they're compliant with state laws. That's where the challenge comes in. It's just the final destination. And if it's coming from Illinois or any state that follows suit with just Delta 9, then we could have some problems.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on that. That's complicated things. We have another question here. Of those 25% of the growers that reported to be profitable, in your opinion, why were they profitable?
Okay, so I guess this would be my opinion. So I think some of them that were probably profitable, maybe they have their own branding. So there are some people who are successfully vertically integrating, and they have, you know, marketing and branding of their products. They are probably successful. And then if there are grain producers, because they're included in there too, you know, if they manage their crop well and got a good yield, they probably could make a profit off that. It's not going to be huge, but it's going to be likely more than corn and beans. So that would probably be a consideration, that there are grain producers in there. I don't think any fiber growers made a profit because their buyer fell through. So we'll put them in the lost money category. But I would say marketing and branding probably has a lot to do with some of the growers' success.
Here's another question. If herbicides become available for use in hemp, what percentage of growers do you think would utilize that tool versus the organic route or beneficial insects?
So I think growers that are really going to look at herbicides, if they are available, are going to be for grain and fiber production, because they want to get early season weed control, and then they'll get canopy closure, canopy cover. CBD growers, I would say the majority of them are really concerned about any kind of residue showing up in extracted material. So they may be a little apprehensive on using any kind of synthetic products, whether that's herbicides, insecticides, or fungicides. There is just that concern of showing up, in extract products, so any kind of distillate, or in consumable products that are going to be inhaled. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and I have some pesticide information coming up.
Another great question is many different processors use many different constituents to extract, from water to CO2 to hethane and mexane. Is there a list of viable processors in the Midwest, and what kind of chemicals they use in the extraction process?
So I am working with Midwest Hemp Council on this list, and hopefully we have it finalized by next week. We've been trying really hard to figure out who's processing and who's processing and is accepting material, because sometimes people will be processing, but they're still in that R&D stage. So we can try to include what kind of method they're using, because we do, even in Indiana, we see CO2, butane, hexane, ethanol, we see lots of different extraction methods. So I'll see about adding that. That's a great suggestion.
Marguerite, is there a preferred extraction chemical?
There are lots of, and I'm not a chemist,
Yeah.
not the expert on processing. I think there are a lot of different reasons why people will pick one solvent or method over another. If you are going to have something that's organic branded and you're going to get your facility certified organic, you have very few options. You have supercritical CO2 or organic ethanol for the most part. So it's going to depend on kind of what market you're trying to target. And then, in some cases, if you're retrofitting any kind of existing processing equipment, what can that equipment handle as far as solvents? Biobin's a good example of that, and they'll talk about that in a couple weeks, about using their, already established facility and switching it over to extracting CBD, and why they use a very specific solvent. So I won't give any details away on that yet. So it's going to depend, what the facility kind of has in mind for products.
Thank you, Marguerite, and thank you, audience, for those great questions. And please keep your questions coming. We'll answer those at the end of Marguerite's presentation. So I'll hand that back over to you, Marguerite.
Thanks, Robert. So I'm going to go over some other challenges. Hopefully this is something that isn't a problem this year, but wet weather in the spring is not going away in Indiana by any means. But we know that hemp doesn't like really saturated soils. And this is a photo from the research farm south of campus. You can see it's pretty flooded. There's lots of weeds popping up. We have issues when we direct seed and you have these really wet conditions. So we're generally telling growers to avoid, clay dominant soils, compacted soils, choose fertile sites. But with CBD hemp, you kind of have a unique situation where you may be able to raise your beds up and get some drainage that way. And if you're in the kind of northwest part of the state where you do have a little bit better drainage in some areas, this may not be an issue. Lack of water may be an issue if we have really dry spells. But this is a problem that growers are now aware of, and they're becoming really careful when it comes to choosing their field sites. So moving forward, just, choose a field site that is going to be adequate, isn't prone to severe flooding. You want to be able to get in the field, even if you're going to raise your beds. And then, of course, fertility is important. And if you have questions about fertility, I can give you some resources at the end as well. Another kind of issue that we saw, and it's a concern among growers, and notice there's question marks here, but there's this question of hemp as a bioremediator. So its ability to pull things out of the soil and store it in plant tissue. There are a couple publications showing that hemp, or cannabis in general, can pull heavy metals out of the soil. We're not sure about pesticides, so there's a question mark. And there are lots of reasons why a pesticide may or may not be pulled up into a plant. So some pesticides may be pulled out of the soil into the plant, some may not. We're not sure with hemp, and we're really not sure if it's a better bioremediator compared to other plants, because lots of different plants will pull things out of the soil. But the concern here, more than anything, is not its ability to pull it out of the soil to clean up soil. Its ability to pull things out of the soil that will then show up in any kind of concentrated form through the extraction process, or if they show up in a consumable product that will be inhaled. So that's the big concern right now. We're not sure what, how contaminated soil has to be concerning for growers, but that's also something to be aware of if you, are working on reclaimed land that, had been a mine, which is the case for one of our growers in Southern Indiana. Just be aware that that may be a potential issue, and processors are looking for heavy metals. Not all processors, but lots of them are looking for heavy metals and different pesticides. Speaking of pesticides, we had some issues with pests last year. Because we had production across the state of Indiana, we saw pathogens, insects, and weeds that we haven't seen in hemp fields. You know, we've seen them in other systems, but we haven't seen them in hemp until last year. And so what we tried to do, because I was fielding lots of questions and lots of complaints, was we tried to figure out what products are available. So on the state chemist website, there's this fairly long list that has Section 3, 24C, and 25B products. So a Section 3 is going to be registered through EPA. That's this top box. This is what we have available for use in the state of Indiana as of now. So EPA approved a bunch of different products, mostly biopesticides, and then they have to be registered in the state of Indiana to make it onto this list. And then 25Bs, which aren't shown here because it's a very long list, are essential oil-based products, not necessarily the most effective for especially pest and pathogen control, but they are options. And then you'll notice this little box here, this 24C, special local needs. So if you're from outside of the state of Indiana, this box will not apply to you. You can call the pesticide office in your respective state or country and figure out if they have any 24C products. But this is a process where our state chemist works with people at the university, gets input from growers, and then works with the registrant of that particular product. So in this case, Certus and Marone. And we put together a special label specific for whatever pests or pathogens we're targeting in hemp. And then we submit that to EPA. If they approve it, that means we can use that product in Indiana based off of this special label. So we do have some products available for 2020 through this 24C process. So we have some products specific for corn earworm like Gemstar and Agree. These are biopesticides. And then we have a couple products specific for indoor use for things like aphids and spider mites and whiteflies. So if you're an indoor producer and you're curious about those products, or if you're an outdoor producer and you're curious, I can give you more information about that as well. So overall, we have a lack of registered products at the federal level. EPA, I think, has approved like 12 or 15 products now, but it's still pretty limited, especially since we haven't done efficacy trials on lots of these products. But they are working at it. We're trying to get some more options for growers. Of course, integrated pest management is what we should focus on first. But if you have, an infestation of corn earworm, there's not a whole lot you can do to mitigate that. So I want to talk about some of the diseases our growers observed and what we're kind of trying to figure out for this year. So we had lots of different root rots, especially Pythium. It was really wet last year, like I mentioned before, so these root rots did really, really well. We have foliar diseases like Cercospora leaf spot. There are lots of foliar diseases that I'll go over, but growers are seeing Cercospora. We've seen it in the hemp research plots back since they started growing in 2015. And then botrytis, bud rot or bud blast, is a really common pathogen that can affect the stem and crown of the plant. So that was pretty common, especially with humid weather towards the end of the season. Growers were seeing a lot of this bud rot. So some of the foliar diseases growers are seeing, like I mentioned, Cercospora. We have Phoma leaf spot, which has been reported to reduce yields from some old literature. And then we have some other leaf spots like Bipolaris, that's from the bottom photo. In Kentucky, this is causing yield loss. So this is not an extensive list by any means, but these are some of the bigger ones we're looking at. As well as powdery mildew. Ashley Adair's name's on there, and I saw she's on the call. But yeah, she found powdery mildew. She found rust. I also found some rust. And then there are viruses that affect hemp that we're just trying to understand a little bit more. We don't see a lot of viruses at this point in Indiana, but other states are struggling. We also have some commonly observed insects. Our most common flower or seed head feeder was corn earworm, a really, really common pest in the landscape. We have European corn borer as the most common stalk boring insect. also very common in the landscape. You're seeing a trend here. We have both of these pests all over the Midwest. They seem to do pretty well in hemp. We have lots of different caterpillar species. If you know what a fall armyworm looks like, they're kind of ugly, so I didn't want to put it up there. I put a zebra caterpillar, but we see lots of different moth caterpillars feeding on the leaves. And then cannabis aphid is our most common fluid sucker. This is a specialist of cannabis. We see it all over Indiana in indoor and outdoor production. But on the bright side, growers are seeing lots of beneficial insects like this ladybird beetle larva or ladybug larva. So they're seeing lots of natural enemies out in the field. I'll show you some photos taken by some of our growers. It's really exciting for us to see biological control in action, because hopefully by encouraging, healthy plants that, may not be as susceptible to pests, we don't need extensive biological control, but it is something that we're already seeing in the field. Corn earworm, again, is a big pest for Indiana hemp growers. This is a link to the corn earworm trapping network. It has traps across the state of Indiana, so you can monitor moth flights. And now that we have some products available, monitoring those moth flights is going to be crucial if you're trying to make applications of products. But we see corn earworm both in CBD production, that's the photo on the left, and in grain production, that's the photo on the right. So this is a pretty nasty little caterpillar. It does a lot of damage. They can bite. They're cannibals. They're pretty disgusting. So they're common in the Indiana landscape. We're trying to get on top of management. Potato leafhopper is another one I'm really interested in, because we did see some pretty extensive damage at some of the grows. So you can see the kind of characteristic leaf scorching on the tips of these leaflets. And then right there is the potato leafhopper nymph. What's really interesting is this particular grower had 10 different cultivars and only one seemed to have this extent of damage. So we may, have the possible option of finding resistant or tolerant cultivars, just like we did in alfalfa. And then this is kind of an interesting segue, but I want to talk about Indiana ditchweed or feral hemp. So we have populations across the Midwest, especially in northern Indiana, but there are populations all over. It's a really good reservoir for hemp specialists like Eurasian hemp borer and cannabis aphid. I found both of these pests in ditchweed. It explains why we started seeing cannabis aphid right when we started producing hemp in 2015 for research. So just be aware that this is a source of lots of these specialist pests. It's also a source of pollen. So this is a free map you can get. It's an EDD map. They map invasive plants. This is the cannabis sativa map. So it includes both marijuana production, illegal marijuana production, and ditchweed. But just be aware that this is a really good source of pollen. So if you're an outdoor CBD producer and you're in some of these counties, especially the counties in Northwest Indiana, where we do see a lot of feral hemp, that's a pollen bank. So just be aware of that. Some of our growers actually went and ground truthed and found all the ditchweed near their hemp field on their property, and they sprayed it early in the season to try to reduce pollen flow. One of those specialists I mentioned was Eurasian hemp borer. This is a pest that does similar damage to corn earworm late in the season, but like European corn borer, it bores into the stalks, feeds, pupates, emerges, and then you have this adult moth here. That's at a commercial grow. What becomes problematic is later in the season when you have floral production, so you're in those reproductive stages, they really like to tunnel into the flowers and feed from the inside out, and they're really protected, where corn earworm is more susceptible to get hit by an insecticide and be able to actually, chew up that plant material and ingest that product. In the case of BT, Eurasian hemp borer is really sheltered within the material, feeding from the inside out. So we're trying to figure out how to manage this pest. But this is something, that you may see in your hemp field. Just be aware that it's a problem. It's going to become more of a problem. So we're going to try to find some solutions quickly. And then for anybody growing indoors, some of your common controlled environment or greenhouse pests are going to be spider mites, whiteflies, thrips, hemp crescent mite, and cannabis aphid. So I have a plant that has really bad spider mite infestation. The leaves are chlorotic. In the bottom photo, you can see little spider mites, little tannish looking critters right there crawling around. And then we have some cannabis aphid, and this is actually an outdoor system. So we see it indoors and outdoors, but populations can get quite high in an indoor system. But what can you do? You can introduce beneficial insects if you're producing indoors. These are lady beetles. These are taken outdoors, but they're completing their life cycle and reproducing on the plants. So we tend to see multiple generations for some of these species. They seem to do really well. They're very happy to be on the plants. We find lots of different lady beetles, not just the Japanese or multicolor Asian lady beetle on the plants. We see lots of native lady beetles as well. Another interesting one for CBD specific growers are praying mantis. We're not exactly sure why they're so attracted to hemp plants, if it's volatile compounds or what, but we see lots of praying mantis in CBD specific fields. They are providing some biological control. They're predators, as many of you may know, but they only have one generation per year. So probably not a beneficial insect you're ever going to artificially introduce, but we want to make sure that they stick around. And then we have lacewings. We find these outdoors, indoor producers are releasing lacewings for biological control. We have two species we find in Indiana for the most part, green lacewings and brown lacewings, but these are, again, good natural enemies that'll eat the small critters like mites and aphids. And then I mentioned cannabis aphid. Populations can get really large. Another potential option that some of our growers actually used in their indoor systems were parasitic wasps. So on the top, we have an aphid mummy. And from that mummy, we had this parasitoid emerge. So this is actually from a field collected aphid. We found a parasitoid, so we didn't introduce these, but growers are successfully introducing parasitoids in controlled environment settings, and they're seeing biological control in action. So growers are having success with this. We're really excited that some of the commercially available parasitoids are working, because we've heard in some cases they're not very effective. So we have a couple faculty on campus that are looking specifically at introducing specific parasitoids for cannabis aphid management. And then the last beneficial insect I kind of want to talk about, or group of insects, are pollinators. Now, people are interested in grain and fiber, which is a really good source of pollen. So we see honeybees, little green sweat bees like you see below, bumblebees, syrphid flies, those hoverflies, using the pollen. Even though it's a wind pollinated plant and it doesn't produce nectar, it's an abundant source of food for these insects. But I've had growers tell me that they see pollinators in their CBD fields, and they see them on the female plants eating trichomes. They're not collecting nectar because the plant doesn't produce any nectar, but they're existing in that operation. And so I think it's important, regardless of what type of hemp you're growing, that as we have more products available, more insecticides available, just be aware that pollinators are in the system, and we want to, of course, have best management practices for natural enemies and pollinators in all types of hemp production. And then I just want to wrap up with weeds. It's the smallest section because there's not a ton of options, but our growers are seeing lots of different weed species in the field. Velvet leaf, giant ragweed, pigweed, and giant foxtail are all really common, but there are other weeds growers see, especially depending on what they previously planted, how they had managed other crops, and what part of the state they're in. So Johnson grass is a common one. Purslane's kind of a unique one. Some of you may not be familiar with purslane, but it actually is an edible weed species. So I joked with one of my growers, if you're going and hand pulling purslane anyway, you might as well try to get another crop, maybe some value added product in your market. You can sell the purslane. And then we have water hemp, morning glory, and cocklebur. So lots of different weed species out in the field. So some of the issues with weed competition in hemp is that the plants are kind of wimpy early in the season, especially if it's cool and damp. It's not as competitive in the first 3 to 4 weeks. And I realize if you're transplanting, 3 or 4 week old plants, you may have an advantage. They may grow faster than people are direct seeding, in a CBD system at least. In grain and fiber, you're always going to direct seed. But the plants just aren't as competitive. weed control is really important early in the season. So we want our growers to be, aware that weeding is important. It may mean hand weeding and CBD production systems. Some of our CBD growers that are also vegetable growers do have mechanical weeding devices. And if you are really interested in looking into some of those devices, they're pretty easily found. There's lots of different weeding systems that organic growers use. So I'd say definitely look at organic resources for weed control, because that's free of synthetic herbicides. You can pull a lot of information from organically managed crops and apply it to hemp. But growers definitely struggled with weed control to the point where some didn't even harvest fields. So that is all I have. This is my contact information. You can email me. That's my office phone. As you all probably know, most of us aren't in our actual offices, but it does forward to my cell phone. And if I miss you, I'll call you from my cell phone. But it's a Michigan number, so don't be alarmed. But, reach out if you have questions. We're on social media. We have a YouTube page where we're putting all these webinars, but I'm happy to, answer any further questions that you have.
Marguerite, first, thank you for that great presentation and really all you do for the hemp industry. You're a tireless soldier out there. Great presentation. Two questions. One's a comment. You really get happy when you talk about bugs. Where'd you get the passion?
Yeah, it's I've loved insects since I was like 7 years old. So I've been collecting for a very long time.
A question we have is a lot of farmers are planting next to corn or soybean. Have you come up with any sacrificial crops that you can plant as a barrier for pest control between the hemp and the corn or soybean?
So we have not done any research on that specifically, but there's a lot of interest. So we're looking at it from an indoor environment first, looking at banker plants, either plants that foster, a natural enemy community, or pulls out pests and they kind of like a trap crop and they kind of hang out there. So we haven't looked at it in hemp. We're really interested in it. We're going to try our best to figure out some options in the coming year, but I don't have an answer for that yet.
Okay. I was down at the Bayer Crop Science test facility down in Tucson, and I talked to some of their specialists. They said that sunflowers and watermelon is something they would recommend for corn. So I'll throw that out there as an area that you may want to try some research on. Another question we had was, has anybody ever used permaculture systems for hemp?
I don't know if anybody in Indiana has done it. I know, excuse me, from a cannabis medicinal standpoint, there are people doing permaculture actually up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that I've talked with. So I am not aware of anybody, but I'm sure somebody is doing that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Again, Marguerite's PowerPoint and her video is going to be available online. She has a YouTube channel, and it will also be available through the Midwest Hemp Council. I'll leave those contact information at the end of the session. Our next webinar is going to be on April 15th on Wednesday. It will address some of those questions. And we scheduled it just in time for the planting season. The session's titled Seeds, Seedlings, and Clones, Hit the Ground Growing. And we have two presenters, Dr. Petrus Langhoven, a horticultural and hydroponic crop specialist in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture at Purdue University, and our own Piper Halpin, co-founder and VP of Operations at Hemplant Farms. And both the speakers are going to focus on CBD crop propagation, and they're going to include the pros and cons of using seeds, seedlings, and clones, the advantages of indoor propagation and the hardening and transplant process. And they'll also share their perspective on how to take young plant starts from the nursery to the field to increase field success rates. And lastly, they'll provide suggestions for optimizing field conditions for transplanting so farmers could hit the ground growing in the 2020 season. So hope you can join that, and hopefully you could help us get the word out to others that might enjoy these. So in closing, I just wanted to let you know that all businesses want two things. They want predictability and consistency. And these unprecedented times are anything but predictable, and the hemp business, as we've all seen, is anything but consistent. But it's challenges like these that make America great. All growth comes from tough times, and Americans are known for taking great risk and turning dreams into reality. So together, we can work together to make this hemp market a viable industry by continuing to exchange ideas and share our experiences. And through these webinars, we're going to do our best to get reliable, useful information out to the hemp community. Thank you for joining us for today's session. We kept us right on time with a great quality presentation from Marguerite. Again, please give her a hand and let her know how good she did through the chat session. I'm Robert Colangelo, reminding you that people are under a lot of stress, so be kind. And join us each Wednesday at noon to make Hump Day Hemp Day. So thank you.